Be compensated by the seller according to the terms in the listing agreement and as noted in the MLS. In this situation, the fiduciary obligations of an agent are owed to whom? So let's reread it. We acknowledged what we got to the bottom last part to see what the question is. Who does the agent owe their fiduciary duties to? Now we need to read it more carefully. A buyer has hired a broker to represent them. The buyer's broker will be compensated by the seller. So that sounds like a buyer agent to me. So who does the agent owe fiduciary to? The buyer who employed them? That sounds pretty good. But they do mention in the question that the seller is going to be compensating that buyer's broker. But we know that that's just the way it works, right? And we also learned specifically from a slide in that agency chapter that just because the broker is looking out for the buyer as their client, owing them all fiduciary duties, all of old car, just because that's where their loyalties lie doesn't matter that they're getting paid from the other side. Just because the seller's paying the buyer's broker doesn't mean that the buyer's broker owes more anything to the seller. They owe all of their fiduciary obligations to their own buyer client. So A is likely the answer. It's not B, seller through the listing broker who's paying the agent. Just because the seller's paying them doesn't mean they owe more fiduciary to them. Everyone who signs the contract. No, that's not true. All the parties involved. That's not true either. Best choice, 21, should be A. There it is. Again, the point of this question is that the one who's paying the commission is not the one you necessarily owe your fiduciary to. What about lead-based paint? Which of the following is true about lead-based paint? Does the seller have an obligation to give the buyer a pamphlet and a required disclosure form? That sounds pretty good. They are required to provide those things, but let's make sure they don't mean seller or listing agent, one or the other, right? The seller is obligated to inspect and remove any lead-based paint. Well, that's not true. They don't have to remove anything. They just need to disclose that it might be there. The buyer must inspect any property built before 78 to determine. Well, anytime you see the words must, always, never, like absolute terms like that, raises a red flag. You're thinking this might not be the right choice because rarely is everything always or never correct. So must is a really strong word. And in this case, we know, no, that buyer's not required to inspect it for lead-based. They just need to be told that it might be there. And they can choose to have it inspected and tested or not. That's part of the disclosure is what are they going to do? Hey, buyer, which is it? Are you going to inspect it or not? The listing broker, the buyer's broker, and the seller are obligated to give the buyer an EPA pamphlet and required disclosure form. So who's required to give it? All of them or one of them? And 22 is A, because it is just the seller's obligation to give the buyer that pamphlet. Now, they're going to get it from their agent. The agent's going to be their resource for getting these things, but it is for the seller to disclose. So answer choice for 22 is A. And as we know, I'll get you on that, Taylor. On agency, on the PSI, there's going to be more agency questions and contracts and finance. So this is another agency, or this is an offer and contract question. After reviewing an offer, 23, the seller changes the price and closing date, initials each change and signs the offer. What has the seller created? Do we have an accepted executory contract? No, because they made a change. They made changes. They essentially rejected it, but then they counter-offered. So provisional offer is not even a thing. We can ignore that. Seller's wish list, that could be a thing that the seller does. There's a form for that called a response to buyer's offer, but that's not what's happening here. What the seller has done is rejected it and counter-proposed or counter-offered. So it's C. That's a counteroffer. 28, a buyer wishing to assign the standard offer to purchase in North Carolina will be allowed to complete the assignment if the contract has what? All right, what is an assignment? What are we talking about with the word assignment? Remember that one? To assign a contract. Is the person who originally went under contract going to be the one closing on the contract when it's an assignment? That's what's happening here, right? The original buyer doesn't end up being the actual buyer. They get it under contract. They get the seller to agree to write it up, and now they're under contract with them. But then instead of closing on it, they, for money, sell it to someone else, assign it to someone else for a fee, probably. So with that in mind, if a buyer wants to assign the contract, they'll be allowed to do so only when. If the contract has been properly notarized, no. Accepted and recorded, no. Contracts don't get recorded. No clause prohibiting the assignment, that sounds pretty good. Been acknowledged and assigned within 72 hours of closing, that's just a bunch of nonsense, right? They just made it sound good. Best choice here, 28, is C. Because as long as the contract doesn't prohibit an assignment, you're allowed to assign it. In our standard contract 2T that we looked at, there is all it says about the assignment is the seller must know about it. You must tell them if you're going to do it. So it doesn't prohibit it. So that's essentially the lesson here. Does that help? Good. A broker listing a property would be obligated to disclose all of the following as material facts, except which one? All right. We might be able to know this before even reading the answer choices, because we know that a broker listing a property would be obligated to disclose. Which one are we not obligated to disclose? Now notice they also say to disclose all the following as material facts. They didn't say a broker would be obligated to disclose all of the following material facts. That word as is important, because if it weren't there, then all four of these answer choices better be material facts, right? Because it had said they were going to be. But in this case, they're not saying that all four of these answer choices are definitely material facts. They're saying a broker would be obligated to disclose the following as material facts. So we're looking for the thing here that's not a material fact, right? And improper drainage on a sloping lot. That'd be material, sure. Water intrusion in the basement when spring rains occur. That's another material fact. Past owner committed suicide and died in the property. Not a material fact. So that might be the only thing we need to get it. That's probably it. What about the next one? Seller finished the basement without a permit. Well, if it's unpermitted improvements on the property, if there have ever been any improvements done to it that were not permitted, meaning they paid and had a permit, acquired a permit from the government to do that construction, then it's a material fact. Unpermitted work is material. So best choice is C. How about this one? Sometimes the commission splits can get a little confusing, so let's do a little recap on that. A salesperson sold the property for $125,900 sale price. The split the salesperson has with their firm is 45% of the commission earned. The commission due to the firm is 5%. What is the salesperson's share of the commission? Now, they don't mention more than one firm. So in this case, it's an in-house sale. And we don't need to worry about like a buyer side and a seller side. Work with what they give us. So they know they give us a sales price of $125,900. We know that the split with the firm versus the broker, it says the split the salesperson has with the firm is 45%. So the broker's getting 45. That means the firm is getting 55. The commission due to the firm is 5%. That's what's getting split between the two. So the broker's getting 45% of 5% of 125.9. So let's do that math. 125.9 times 5% is a total commission of 62.95. And then we need to determine 45% of that. So that broker's check is $28.32.75. And they're just going to dollars here. So they've got a 28.33 option as A. So 30 is answer A. Requirements for types of plumbing, electrical, and other building materials are determined by what? Building codes. There it is. Feels like there's a lot of A answers. A's and C's. Zoning is not right. Zoning doesn't handle that. Zoning handles what you can do with the property, like property types. A sheet, that's a word we had to learn, a weird one. But that just means what happens to the property when there's someone dies with no will and no heirs. The state can take it. The state gets it through this sheet. And special use, that's something that's related to zoning. You can get a special use permit. But the thing that requires how a house is built, how a property must be built in terms of electrical, like gauges of wire, insulation, R values, we'll talk a little bit. It's a tiny chapter on construction. Plumbing, right? Pipes, types of pipes. Can't just use any old certain kind of pipe. And other building materials. What's allowed? What's going to keep that property from falling down and killing people, right? And becoming a hazard, unsafe. Those are the building codes. Number 33, agents owe all of the following fiduciary duties. Well, which ones do we owe to everybody? Out of all the old car fiduciary duties, what do agents owe to everybody, regardless of their status as a client or customer? We owe everybody reasonable skill, care, and disclosure, right? The last two letters of old and car. So which one do we not? That's what we're looking for in this. Disclosure of benefits and risks in a transaction. Reasonable skill by completing the seller's disclosure. Oops, that sounds sketchy. Loyalty to the principal and putting the principal's interest above all others. That's true. We do owe loyalty, so that is actually one of the fiduciary duties. We're looking for the thing that's not. B, disclosure of benefits and risks. Yeah, we owe them that. C is the best answer because it's actually not what we owe them. We can't complete the seller's disclosure. We're not exercising reasonable skill if we're completing the seller's disclosure because we're not allowed to touch it. Well, we can touch it. We can't fill it out. We can't put pen to paper. They fill that out. So they gave you a term that we do owe the client, but they paired it up with something we're not allowed to do. So just carefully read those answer choices. Two neighbors, Chris and Sandy, have lived next door for years. Their friendship survived many ups and downs. Chris is saddened when Sandy announces they have to sell their house and move away. Because they're such good friends, Sandy agrees to sell to Chris at a bargain price. They're close friends, so they don't hire anybody. They don't hire brokers or attorneys to write the contract. They write the terms of sale on a piece of letter paper and sign the document. In this case, the parties have what? All we know is there's no brokers or attorneys involved. Can parties to the transaction create their own contract and sign it as a promise to do stuff? Sure, they can. It may not be perfect. It may have missed some possible loopholes and things that could create problems later, but all we know from this question is two parties, buyer and seller, wrote it up. They don't go into details. Don't let your mind wander and think, yeah, but did they include this? They write the terms of sale on a piece of paper and sign them. Which terms? Doesn't matter. They just say the terms, so we can only assume it's the relevant terms. So what do we have? No contract because it was not prepared by an attorney. That's not true because it doesn't have to be prepared by an attorney. A void contract as it has not met all essential elements. We don't know what the elements are, so we can't assume that they're not all the essential ones. They would have told us because it would have mattered to the question. So we need to make the assumption that it's all the right terms. All they say is they write the terms of the sale. Voidable but binding if both close and the deed is passed. Voidable would be someone's not 18, sane, or sober. So best choice for 35 should be A, because they don't give us a reason to assume there's anything wrong with it. How about an old school math question from way back in the day when we were just freshmen? Way back in those first couple of weeks. A legal description states, starting at the corner of Apple Way, go 300 feet east to Cedar Street, 150 feet to Stillwater, 300 more back to Birch, and 150 north to Apple Way. Notice there's only two different numbers, either 300 or 150. So that sounds like it's going to be a rectangle. And you could actually use your scratch paper and draw it out if that's helpful. So we're going to start somewhere at a corner. We're going to go 300 feet east to Cedar Street. We're going to go 150 feet south to Stillwater. We're going to go back west again, and then we're going to go north. And so we've got a 150 by 300 foot shape. And that's all we need to work with. What do we do? 300 times 150 is a 45,000 square foot property. And that's all they're asking. Okay, good. We don't even have to convert it to acreage, but they could. So all they wanted to know is how many square feet is it? And it's D, 45,000. But you know I was going to do it. What if they said acres? How many acres in this 45,000 square foot property? What's the magic number for square feet in an acre? 4 something. First one to answer gets $500 from their neighbor. There it is. Good job, Talon. Let me know if your neighbor gave you the money. 43,560 square feet in an acre. We want to know the number of acres. That's the other thing on the bottom of this T formula. And so we know that there are 45,000 square feet in this lot. So we just need to divide. 45,000 divided by 43,560. This lot has 1.03 acres. But they didn't need that. All they were asking for in this case was square feet. But they could very easily ask, and by the way, we may as well do it. What if the question also said land sells for $33,000 an acre? How much would this lot cost or be worth? If land sells for $33,000 an acre and it's 1.3 acres. Now just multiply them together, right? 1.03, it's going to be close to 33,000 times 33,000. It'd be 33, I can't write threes fast. 33,990. So any of those three possibilities: square footage, how many acres is it, or how much will it cost depending on a certain price per acre. Could be any of the ways that they ask acre related things. Oh, I owe you a break. I'll see you back in 10. Any other questions on the midterm? I'll spend a little bit more time. Let me just scan it real quick, but we're going to move on unless you tell me otherwise. And by the way, anytime here forward, this is all fair game. So tomorrow, next week, whenever, if you ever find yourself looking through the midterm or any of the practice exams and you have questions, let me know, and I'll be glad to look them over, talk them through in class. So this is not the only time we'll do this. We'll treat it as a sort of a review exercise anytime. All right, let's do these two additional ones, and then we'll call it on this midterm, and then go on into our closing, finishing up chapter 12 on closings. While holding an open house at one of her firm's listings, Sally meets an interested buyer for the property. During their conversation, the buyer asks Sally how much the seller really wants for the home. Sally replies that the seller would probably take $5,000 less than the listing price. Do we have a problem? Doesn't say anything about the person hiring Sally. It's one of her own firm's listings. So she's a sub-agent to the seller here. And she's already said that she thinks they'd probably take less than asking price. Is it her place to give advice to someone on the other side of the transaction, which is essentially what's happening here? The buyer asks Sally if she could fill out the offer to purchase with the lower price. Sally agrees, assuring the buyer that the seller will be delighted with this offer. In this case, Sally is acting as what? Oh boy. We know that she met someone. They had a conversation. The buyer asked what the seller really wants. She threw out a number. The buyer said, okay, write it up. There's no mention of talking about the working with agents disclosure. There's no mention of a buyer agency agreement. Therefore, all we have to go on is what they say in the question. No assumptions. Can't make any other assumptions. Therefore, what is her role automatically? If nothing else is done, what is her automatic default role for all of her firm's listings? What is she? By default, she's a sub-agent to the seller, but what is she acting like? She's acting like a dual agent, but they didn't talk about dual agency. So it's looking a lot like undisclosed dual agency. 47 should be C. There it is. There, you got it. The wrong way to do it, right? She did it wrong. Phil is happy to have found a home he loves and can afford. He doesn't have a lot of money for down payment, so he's going to use an FHA loan, which allows for only 3.5% down. The home has a market value of $190,000. Phil agrees to pay full price to guarantee he'll get the home. What he really likes is that it is in the city and there's a lot of social activity, but he's worried about the taxes. And since he's on a limited budget, every penny matters. So the assessed value of the home is 80% of the market value. The county tax rate last year was 75 cents per $100. The city tax rate was 85 cents per $100. How much will be paid? How much will he have to pay in annual property tax? Is it in the city limits? We've got two different tax rates. I'm just going to jot down some numbers off of here that I'll flip over to the board here in a second. So is it in the city limits? Which tax rate do we need to work with? You tell me in the chat, please. Yeah, it says the property is in the city. And when that's the case, we have to use them both. So here's what we're looking at. Since it's in the city limits, we've got to add them both together. So that is, what's that, $1.60 per $100. And do we know the tax value? No, but we know how to get it. We know the property value is $190, and we know the assessed value is 80% of that. So the tax value is $152. So he's going to have to pay $1.60 per 100 on 152. What does that look like? The rate goes on the bottom, that $1.60. The assessed value goes on the bottom, the 152. And then the annual taxes is what we're figuring up. One important thing we need to do with the rate is convert it to the proper decimal. That means dividing it by 100, since it's dollars per 100, which means you could just plug it in and push the percent sign, or you could do it just this way, because you know that you're moving the decimal over 2 places to the left. If you take $1.60 and hit the percent sign, it does it for you. So there's that decimal version that we need. The 0.016 is what we're going to multiply by the tax value to give us our annual tax bill. $24.32 is what Phil has to pay every year in annual taxes. See if that's one of the choices. And there it is. Letter B. 48. Again, let's come back to that. You tell me anytime, and that includes any of the practice exams. Go ahead and work your way through them. I just start with one, work your way through, take those practice exams and retake them. You notice how I did this with you tonight. I looked through every answer, even when we saw one that wasn't the right one clearly. So when you go through an answer, pay attention to the wrong ones as well. And you get more out of the practice exams. Pay attention to the wrong one answer choices and think, what would make this the right choice? So just use it as one big review. Don't just say, oh, what's the real estate broker lien? Which one? Okay, done. Next. That's tempting. Do that the first time. But then go back through these things, guys. You'll get more value out of it, right? Now, let's go through, do a little recap where we ended up last time. Talk about closing. We've got a good bit of math to do tonight, so buckle up. There we go. We left off talking about RESPA, and we had learned that RESPA stands for Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. It is the legal requirement of how settlement meetings go. What's supposed to happen with a settlement? What's required of the lenders? What's required of the brokers? And it's all revolving around protecting the consumer. So making sure the consumer isn't harmed by a lender, because historically, leading up to 2008, there were some lenders that were dirty and they tricked people, right? They told them, well, everybody else is charging 6.5% for the loan amount or for the interest rate, but we'll do it for 5%. And it wasn't until maybe later in the transaction that they found out that lower interest rate was only possible because they surprise attacked them and said, oh, by the way, you got to pay 3 discount points. I doubt that math works out for the numbers I just quoted, but point is, now RESPA says you can't hide things in the fine print, lenders. You have to disclose it openly, transparently. So let's look at how they do that. They've got to provide accurate estimates. And we also learned that there are 2 main documents associated with this process. Let's look at them firsthand. I happen to have them pulled up. The one that's required in the beginning of the process is called the loan estimate. And let's look at it. We looked at one filled out the other day, but it bears looking at again. Here's the loan estimate. Notice the titles here, loan estimate, the terms of the loan, like the actual loan amount, interest rate, how much the payment's going to be. Will there be a prepayment penalty? Is there a balloon payment? What is a balloon payment? That means there's one final, very last payment that's going to be higher than all the others were because you amortized it to a longer term, and so the last payment's going to not be equal to all the others. It's going to be a balloon. It's going to be larger. Is that the case? If so, what is that larger balloon payment going to be? And then if we were to dissect the loan mortgage payment itself every month, $1,500 payment, how much of that is going toward principal and interest compared to mortgage insurance, compared to the escrows? What are they talking about with escrow? What are they escrowing for with that mortgage payment? 2 things. Tell me in the chat, please. What gets escrowed? Insurance is one of them. You got it. And taxes. Yeah, let me change this so everybody sees answers now. Taxes and insurance. That's what gets paid a little at a time with every payment. It doesn't have to be. A buyer could say, hey, lender, I'm a responsible person. I have great credit. I've proven myself. I don't want you to collect for taxes and insurance. I'll just pay it myself every year. Maybe they just want to have that money and keep it in their account, and they're getting interest on that money themselves. And they're like, you know what? No, I'll pay you the principal and interest. I'm not paying you the taxes and insurance. That's okay. They're allowed to do that. The lender doesn't prefer it, but the buyer could choose to do that. But they better not miss payments, right? They better not get in trouble. If the taxes don't get paid, if the insurance coverage lapses, the lender finds out, and then the lender is going to step in and say, are you sure about this? Let's go ahead and let us pay it. So the escrow may not even be filled out here because it's not being collected, but usually it is. Most people do, in fact, do it that way. And then the last 2 things on this page are, how much will the total closing costs be for all the various things the buyer has to pay for? We're going to see what those things are in this chapter. And so that number is going to be here as well, probably in the thousands. And then also, finally, the amount that the buyer needs to bring to closing, estimated cash that needs to be brought to closing. Some of the things along the way throughout this under contract period have been credited to the buyer's side. What were 2 things related to the transaction that were credits to the buyer that are already into the mix, so to speak? What gets credited to the buyer's side at closing? Do you remember those things? Think about the contract, the offer and contract period. What amounts of money were dealt with during the offer and then when that became a contract? What did the buyer have to give to the seller for one thing? Due diligence. You got it. Non-refundable. They have to write the check to the seller. Seller can go ahead and spend it because they're probably never going to have to give it back to the buyer, even if the buyer chooses to walk away before closing and not actually buy the house. That's their right, but that right comes at the cost of the due diligence money. But now we have a successful closing. Therefore, the due diligence check that was given to the seller is credited to the buyer's side. It's that much less the buyer needs to bring. So that number is going to be factored into this. The attorney paralegal will say, oh, it was a $10,000 due diligence check. Well, we were going to tell the buyer that they had to bring $15,000 to closing, but since that $10,000 due diligence fee is into the transaction, they only need to bring $5,000, right? Because they get a credit for that due diligence amount. We'll see where that fits in later as well. So just notice that on every lender who gives a loan estimate to a borrower, if that borrower shops around with different lenders, this is what they have to show them. They can't hide the interest rate. They can't hide the prepayment penalty. It shows up on the same place. It's easy for the buyer to compare apples to apples. Thank you, Libby. Also, earnest money counts as a credit too. Due diligence and earnest money. So that's what it looks like. And we're going to get into this part tonight. They've categorized different closing costs the buyer has to pay into 3 blocks. And we'll get into them. I won't steal my own thunder. And then, I don't know why this has replications. Sorry. And the rest is just kind of words. Don't worry about it. Just what terms are. But mainly those first 2 pages. Notice this loan estimate first page looks a lot like the closing disclosure first page. There it is. The loan amount, the interest rate, the payment, the balloon if there is, the prepayment, the dissection of the payment into principal, interest, taxes and insurance and PMI, closing costs total, and then cash needed at closing by the buyer. And then that second page is similar. Oh, no, it's the same one. Now, where this is the closing disclosure, this is the thing the lender has to provide to the buyer before the closing within 3 days. At least 3 days before closing, no closer to closing than that. If something changes like the interest rate at the last minute and closing is tomorrow, but then the interest rate changes, the lender has to do a new one of these and give it to the buyer, and we're not closing tomorrow. That buyer has to have 3 more days before closing. It's going to close in 3 days from that point because of RESPA requirements. More specifically, TRID, which stands for Truth in Lending Act, Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, Information Disclosure. The borrower gets the loan estimate, this one, within 3 days from the loan application being put in. And then the borrower has to be given this one, the closing disclosure, no sooner than 3 days before the closing date. Notice the closing disclosure has a lot more details. It goes, and we get into all of these in 302. Post 302, we learn all about this closing disclosure. It's where we put every dollar, every penny from the transaction. This page is just 2 columns, buyer side, seller side, and the expenses each of them are paying. This whole page is nothing but expenses paid either by the borrower or by the seller. Then the total borrower's expenses from this page go here. Total sellers goes in their column, and those amounts come over to this other page, which essentially is 4 blocks. All of the borrower's debits, a debit meaning you got to pay it, and then the buyer borrower's credits, meaning you're getting credit for this amount of money. That's the buyer's side is on the left. Seller's side is on the right. And then finally, this is what shows the agent and the borrower what they're going to have to bring. What's the borrower need to bring to closing? It's going to show up right here. And then on the seller's side, how much is the seller going to get from their sales proceeds after they pay commission and everything else? Going to go down here. Hopefully a positive amount for them. Sometimes they have to bring money to closing. So just think about these things and how they are related, and that's kind of what we're dealing with here. Now, that is the accurate estimate for settlement charges. That's how they give that accurate estimate, is through those two specific kinds of documents. Every lender has to use that. RESPA also talks to us as brokers, and they're not all about just what is the lender not allowed to do or required to do, but also what about brokers? And the RESPA says that we brokers cannot get kickbacks from other settlement agent providers or settlement providers. What's a settlement provider? Anybody involved in the settlement. The inspector, the attorney, the appraiser. They can't pay a broker to send them a piece of business. Maybe you have a great great home inspector that you like to recommend. If you recommend them to your buyer because they slip you $100 under the table, then that's what's not allowed here. No kickbacks. But if you recommend them to your buyer because they've always done great work for buyers, they've always given them good insight, given them a report, done it in a timely manner, and been willing to talk to them with questions, that's better, right? That's okay. RESPA also puts a cap on how much the lender is allowed to collect for taxes and insurance escrow. Restricts the excessive escrow amounts. They can't collect more than a certain minimum toward taxes and insurance. But you better believe if they were allowed to legally, a lender would do it, because that's just more money in their account that they could get interest paid to them with. But that escrow amount has to just cover the purpose intended. Regulation X under RESPA says this is all about residential property. RESPA doesn't apply to commercial. It covers most residential 1 to 4 units, single family homes, condos, townhomes, all of that have to comply with RESPA. And it also applies to any loan that is federally related. And we left off the other night where I said, look, it is not bad to think that means FHA, VA, but it actually means even more than that. Because since 2008 happened and the government had to step in and say, look, lenders, you screwed this whole thing up. You really caused a catastrophe. We are going to oversee things from here forward. So there is government oversight in terms of all loan types. So when it says federally related new loan, that's conventional as well with that kind of an idea in mind. The lender has to give that loan estimate that we looked at just now, along with a little pamphlet that says, here's what happens if you don't pay your mortgage. And they have to do that within 3 days of the buyer making application for the loan. What's application? When they give the address of the property that they're going to buy. And then that was this one. And then the other one, fast forward to closing, give the closing disclosure document within 3 days before settlement, not sooner than 3 days before settlement. Okay. The lender is going to charge, right? They're charging money. What's one way a lender's making money in a transaction? Tell me in the chat. Why is a lender doing this? They're not doing it for fun. Doing it to make money. What's the biggest way that lenders are making money when they loan money on a mortgage? Interest. You got it. But guess what? There's others. Lenders getting interest, but they're also getting some other stuff too. They get paid lots of different ways. And the buyer, has to pay lots of different fees. Yeah, points too. There might be some discount points. But the buyer has to pay all kinds of different fees, several of them loan-related fees. Some other fees the buyer has to pay are what? You tell me. What does a buyer purchasing a property need to pay for in that purchase? The various things that are involved, if you had to guess. We haven't talked about it. We're about to. We looked at the contract a little bit, but what are some things the buyer is going to need to pay for? Some of many, many. The appraisal, you bet. Credit check, you got that right. Yep. One of the smaller ones, at least. Thank goodness. The appraisal is probably anywhere from $400 or $500 to $1,000. What else? Think the due diligence period. What's happening during that due diligence period? All the various expenses, not just loan stuff, but everything shows up on this closing disclosure. And it includes what? What would you want? Yeah, there we go. If you were buying a property, you'd want it surveyed. You want to make sure it's within the right lines. There's no encroachments. What about the house itself? Are we okay with the condition? Do we feel confident it's built right? There it is. That's what I'm looking for. Inspections. There could be a lot of them. Inspections, estimates for repairs, but a lot of loan fees too. And so this particular slide is talking about how the lender has to disclose these various expenses to the buyer in three broad categories. There's the category where the lender has to tell the buyer exactly how much the thing is going to be. And it's because the lender has full control over what has been being charged. So that category is this top box. There's no, it's the last box, the zero difference there at the very bottom. It's what the lender chooses to charge. Therefore, it can't vary at all. From what they promised to the buyer and with the loan estimate compared to what it actually ends up being on the closing disclosure, there can be no difference. And if it's more than what the lender promised, the lender has to pay for it. They have to eat it, absorb it, because they have full control over that charge. That's the requirement that they have under this TRID regulation, TILA RESPA disclosure. So there's the zero tolerance category, meaning whatever the lender charges better not change. If it does, the lender has to pay for it. What they promised on the loan estimate better match up on the closing disclosure. And if we look again back at that closing disclosure, we'll see where those go. Here they are. One of the pages shows it. Says, calculating cash to close. Use this table to see what changed from your loan estimate. In other words, 30 days ago, 40, 60 days ago, whenever that loan estimate happened compared to today. We're looking here at the disclosure, the seller disclosure, or the closing disclosure. So it says, what were the items on the loan estimate in this column? And then what did the final tally of costs end up being? And was there a change? They have to say, yep, it changed. It increased by this amount, if that applies. So these things are what we're talking about. And this is where they would have to admit, yep, we were off a little bit. Now, some of the things the lender counseled them on or promised with the loan estimate, the lender has to cover. The lender has to eat it if they're wrong. But then there's another category called the 10% bucket. And that means if it's something the lender gave the borrower to pick from a list of vendors or providers, then the lender does still have responsibility over the costs. The lender says, look, I gave you a list to pick from on these items, and therefore, if I'm wrong by more than 10% over, then I'll cover it. I'll eat it. You only have to pay for it, borrower, up to 10% over if I'm wrong on my estimate. And then finally, the third bucket on this slide is nothing. We're not holding the lender responsible on this chunk of things at all. If the lender is wrong on what the home inspection is going to cost, it's not their problem because it was up to the buyer to choose that provider. The lender couldn't force them to pick a certain home inspector. Didn't give them a list either. Didn't give them a list to pick from. They just said, you might want to get a home inspection. Leave us out of it. So that's one of the items that's a no limit issue. The borrower picks certain things under this bucket of items, then it's all on the borrower. The lender's not going to have to cover that. Let me show you where those things go. So here's the closing disclosure page about the expenses only. These aren't every single expense. This isn't all of them, but everything on this page is an expense. Nothing on this page is a credit to the buyer or the seller. And so here it is under loan costs. For one thing, the box A, they label it origination charges, but it's going to have discount points in there possibly. Basically anything the lender chooses to charge. This is the box of things that the lender has to cover even if they're wrong back when they made the promise with the loan estimate. Your origination fee is going to be 1%. Fast forward to the closing disclosure, it better say 1% on here. If it doesn't, if it says 1.5%, then that lender's got to pay that extra half. You with me? Discount points the same way. This second box, B, is the 10% box. This is the one that says the lender's going to give them a list of vendors they could choose from. And then if they're wrong from the loan estimate compared to the closing disclosure right here, then the lender has to absorb anything more than 10% over what they estimated it was going to cost. And then C are the things the borrower has complete control that the lender's not making any recommendations of. Therefore, the lender's not obligated to pay any overages. If the borrower chooses to have a home inspection and the lender says it might cost $500, but it was really $1,000, that's because the borrower picked a home inspector that charges $1,000. Maybe it was worth it, maybe not. Maybe they also chose to get a mold inspection specialist to look at it, and a radon inspection add-on, and a termite inspection or wood destroying insect. So that's kind of where we're looking at the 0% wiggle room, meaning lender has to pay any overage. The 10%, meaning lender has to pay for more than if it's 10% over. And then the no tolerance, meaning it's not up to the lender at all. Therefore, the borrower has to pay it. RESPA also regulates business arrangements, controlled business arrangements. In other words, sometimes a real estate firm also owns a mortgage company, but they can't require the buyer to use their own mortgage company. They have to say, hey, buyer, we have one for your convenience, but we do own it. It is officially under our ownership umbrella, and that's fair warning to you. Just so you know, if you choose this lender, we own that mortgage company. You might want to know that. It probably doesn't matter to them, but RESPA requires that they disclose that they are also the owner. So they can't say you should use this lender, but it's really because they want to make profit on that loan, right? Not that it's really necessarily the best choice for that buyer's needs. Borrower credit for yield spread premiums. That just means that the lender makes money on the front end of making the loan and also on the back end when they sell the loan. And so the borrower needs to be told where this money's being made. And if the amount of money being escrowed surpasses a certain level, the lender has to credit them back a certain amount of money. There's something called an aggregate adjustment that keeps all that in check and in balance. RESPA requires that. Account restrictions for setting up the escrow, and then servicing disclosures. That just means, is this lender going to sell the loan to another bank? If it's a good credit, like conventional loan, then the odds are pretty good they will, because those are easy to sell. Banks are willing to pay more money for the lower credit chunks of mortgages when they buy and sell on the secondary market. So this lender might end up servicing the loan the whole time you have it for the entire 30, 20 years or not. They have to tell you what's their plan. This is a big one, though. As a recap, as brokers, we can't get kickbacks for referring heartbeats to other settlement service providers. Heartbeats, humans. It's a lead. Can't charge for leads, right? My buyer, hey buyer, you should use this inspector, a lender, this closing attorney, because I'm going to get paid if you do. Not allowed. And that's falls under Regulation X of RESPA. And don't try to just get around it by saying, oh, it wasn't money, it was Panther tickets. It was a gift card to a restaurant. Anything of value is what applies here. So out of that entire settlement statement that we just looked at, what are we as brokers responsible for? We need to check that settlement statement. We need to check that, another word, settlement statement, closing disclosure. I'll use either one interchangeably. We as brokers are not required to check the accuracy of the entire thing. Every single one of those items, no. Let's look at them again. Out of all of these possible things on this page and then also this page, a lot of them we need to double check, confirm, make sure the math was done right. But we're not responsible for everything because look at what some of them are. It's not on us to know what the origination charge is for that lender that the buyer chose. That buyer might have picked that lender because we recommended them, or they might have picked the lender because they found them on Google through a Google search. Rocket Mortgage is an online lender. That's not on us. So out of this entire closing disclosure, we are responsible for a lot of it because a lot of it comes from the contract. But the lender-related things, we are not held to a responsibility for double checking. They need to, the borrower needs to check with the lender, and they will. That lender, that good loan officer will call this buyer, say, hey, let's talk about these loan fees. I'm looking at the closing disclosure, and I see that they have the origination fee correct. It's 1.5%. The discount points is correct. So they'll do that. And then we as brokers are going to look through the inspection cost. That's going to be listed in this box. The homeowner's insurance premium, prepaids and escrow amounts. We know how to do all this kind of math, as we'll learn in a minute. Recording fees, things like that, we can handle. And this box is also for commission. Commission will be listed down here. So that's what we're responsible for. The real estate commission says the broker's responsible for stuff that the broker knows about. Sorry, there it is. Contract price, because that came from the contract. Due diligence, earnest money, anything else. Maybe the seller's paying $5,000 toward the buyer's closing costs. We would need to double check, make sure that's on there. Commission amounts, that's the easy one. It's the first thing we check. Credits to either side. Things paid by a broker. Maybe the broker's buying a warranty for the buyer because the seller refuses to, but you want to make sure your buyer has one. So you decide to pay for it from your commission. Would you do that? I would, especially for, certain levels of commission earnings. If I'm making 10, 15, 20 grand on a commission check, you bet I'm going to give somebody an $800 warranty. I have no problem with that. If it keeps everybody happy and keeps their hand signing papers, let's get this thing closed and signed. Everybody's happy. The only thing they're arguing about is a warranty. Nobody wants to buy it. I'll buy it. Give me my $14,000 instead of my $15,000, right? There's a lot to be said for momentum. By the way, that's another reason I don't race to the bottom in the early days of getting business. Like when I first get a listing, when I first get a buyer, I'm not trying to be the cheapest one they pick because I want to make sure I have enough left in the tank that I call happiness money in case I need to buy some smiles on people's faces later because somebody wants a warranty and everybody's saying I'm not buying it, or heck, a refrigerator or a carpet cleaning or something that the parties just got all in an uproar about, and somebody wants it and they're putting their foot down. They're not closing if they don't get it. I want to have enough room to be able to let's just move past this. Let's go on and close this thing. What would it take to make you stop complaining and sign the bottom line? Everything else cool? Okay, great. We're $300 carpet cleaning away from this being a successful transaction. Okay, I'll do that. Maybe me and the other agent combined. I'm not going to take it to a crazy extreme, but it's all about that end game, right? So we need to check these items: credits to the parties, invoices to be paid, repairs, home warranty invoice, make sure it's on there. Everything needs to be on the closing disclosure. What's the problem if everything that was spent, credited or spent, debited or credited, is not on the closing disclosure? What could we run into as a problem if we don't have everything included on that thing? It's called potentially loan fraud. It needs to be on this closing disclosure so the lender will know about it. It needs to be in the contract and on the closing disclosure. If somebody says, you know what, the seller will give $11,000 toward the buyer's closing costs, but then you find out the lender won't let them pay that much because the lender actually has a cap on how much they're allowing a seller to pay for buyer's closing costs. Maybe instead of $11,000, they'll only let them pay $9,000. Well, it would not be okay for that seller to wink at you and say, well, how about I just meet with you in the lobby before closing, and I'll give them a gift card for $2,000. Is it reflected on the closing disclosure? No, we'll just keep this informal. That will be loan fraud. You're hiding from the lender an amount of money from the transaction. Why does it matter? Because the problem would come up if could the buyer really actually afford the house without that chunk of money? If they couldn't, and they ended up going into default and going into foreclosure, the lender's got to deal with some charges and inconvenience and time and trouble of going through the foreclosure. So by not sharing with the lender a sizable chunk of money that actually has to be repaid or accounted for somehow, and it affects that buyer actually not being able to keep paying the loan on time, that's the problem. That's sort of the idea we're looking at here. So this loan fraud thing got a lot of people in trouble around 2008, 9, 10. There were dirty lenders working with agents, working with closing attorneys, working with appraisers, and they were all essentially, the bad ones, working together to essentially lie to the investor whose money was being loaned to the buyer. They would say, look, it appraised for $590,000 because the dirty appraiser made it look that way, but it really was only worth $520,000. So there's $70,000 fake dollars in there. The parties somehow worked it out, got it funded, and were able to divvy it up, and that's just one way to do loan fraud. What happens when you commit loan fraud, violate RESPA? Well, the RESPA violations could result in a $10,000 fine per violation. You do something wrong, you break one of these RESPA rules we talked about, $10,000 for a violation. Up to a year imprisonment. And then also having to compensate the victim, getting sued and having to pay the victim. And because it was a RESPA-related violation, when you have to pay that victim compensation, go ahead and multiply by 3. Treble the damages. Civil lawsuits times the damages declared in court by 3. That's how weighty this RESPA thing is. You got to follow RESPA because the consequences are pretty severe. Loan fraud itself is not on this slide, but loan fraud, basically not telling the lender about dollar amounts that are going between the parties, not reflecting such things on the closing disclosure, that could be $1 million fine and 30 years in prison. There was a broker in Charlotte, South Charlotte, once upon a time, and she was doing great. Single mom of like 3, I guess at the time, maybe middle school to elementary school. Doing great, killing it. I remember her ads. She sold in the 500,000+ to $1 million, South Park, South Charlotte, all that stuff. Doing great. Her ad was her hanging out the top of a limo, and she said, "This is how I show houses to my clients." And I thought, well, okay, good for you. But good luck negotiating your commission. Somebody's probably going to want a discount if they think you're using a limo. But anyway, she ended up talking to a guy who approached her with some deals, and he said, "Look, I've got connections with properties and attorneys and lenders, and I'm going to be the consultant. I want you to help with the real estate side of it." And so she got into business with him, started doing deals with him, and they were pretty easy and lucrative, and it worked great. He kept bringing her deals. He was getting paid in the mix too, and I believe he was not licensed, so that was one of the problems. But come to find out, it was a big problem. She, in fact, after the fact, she wrote a book about it. She wrote a book, and in the book she says, I kind of had this itch in my mind, a voice in my head saying, this isn't quite right. This isn't quite above board. Some of the things they were doing with the moving of the money and disclosing and not disclosing things. But she kept doing it because it was just easy. And she thought, well, not hurting anybody. Let's just keep on going. I'm got even more sales from this. I'm supporting my family. Well, she got visited by a couple of gentlemen in suits at the office one day. The upfront people at the office said, "Hey, come on down. You got somebody here to see you." And she took them into the conference room, and it was two men. And she said their suit coats kind of flapped open, and she saw the guns and the badges. They were from the FBI field office in Charlotte, investigating loan fraud. And they said, you're so-and-so, and you've been working with this gentleman who was the consultant guy. And she said, yeah, him, I know him. And they asked her questions for about 5 minutes. And she kept answering, and they said, "Ma'am, at this point, I think the best course of action for you is to consult an attorney. You need to go ahead and retain." And I thought, that's not how it works in TV and in movies. I was expecting them to take her into the basement with the light bulb and interrogate her for 3 days. But they actually said, "Get an attorney, we'll be in touch." So they left. She went to her broker in charge, and the BIC said, "Oh, no big deal. That happens sometimes." And she was, of course, terrified, right? Long story short, she was found guilty of loan fraud. The guy was in trouble. She was in trouble. She, in fact, had to be on a 3-way phone call with the real estate commission explaining what happened. And she remembers that she heard the breathing on the other end while she was explaining what's happening. And tell me in the chat, guess what the real estate commission said to her? What did they do about her license when she said, "Yeah, so apparently this happened and I'm going to be convicted of loan fraud," or whatever it is? What do you think the real estate commission's reaction was? I think eventually that was what happened, the revocation. But what their initial reaction was, they said, "Look, we appreciate that you've been cooperative. You had this phone call. You've answered our questions. You've not tried to hide anything that we can tell. We also appreciate that you are the main support for your kids, and that you have about 9 months worth of things that are under contract still yet to close. And that you're also probably a year away from your court date and being convicted or tried or whatever." They gave her 9 months to wrap up her real estate transactions so that she could get paid on the outstanding stuff, so that she could have a last little bit of influx of cash to support a family. And she did have to spend time. She actually spent, I think, a couple of years in West Virginia, Martha Stewart prison, I call it, the same one that Martha Stewart was in. So she did time for loan fraud. And when she got out, she wrote a book about it. And she went about right before COVID, for about a year before COVID, she was on the speaking circuit, talking to realtors, talking to different firms, saying, "Here's how loan fraud works. Don't do it." Right? Here's how to recognize it. And frankly, she probably made more money doing that than she ever did selling houses. But I don't think I would want to pay that price for admission. But then COVID hit, and I don't know if she started doing it online. Her name is Holly Pasut. You could get her book on Amazon, and and probably find some videos on her as well. She's very open about it. It's not a secret by any means, but just a nice little insight into what this really looks like, and probably a good thing to study. So another way loan fraud could attack, so to speak, and then we'll take our break, is this. If, for instance, a first-time home buyer needs help with their down payment, they could get a gift from their parents. And so part of that would mean the parent signs a form saying, this is officially a gift. I do not expect it to be paid back. It's got to really truly be a gift, not expected, not a loan. So they have to sign that. If they signed that, and then you're showing them houses, you know that they're doing gift money, you're showing mom and dad plus the buyer houses, and you hear them talking in the back seat because you're driving around from house to house, and the kid says, hey, mom, dad, really appreciate you loaning me this money. I'll pay you back when I get my tax refund, but you know it's a gift. That's the problem. That would be you witnessing the future commission of a crime, right? They're thinking, they're talking about committing loan fraud. So to avoid that, let's make sure that they understand, look, if you get gift from somebody, it better really be a gift. If it's not a gift, it's loan fraud. Because you're telling the lender one thing and doing another. Again, if it could end up resulting in that buyer defaulting on their loan because without the gift, they couldn't really afford it. But since they now have to pay their house payment plus pay back the person that was supposedly giving them the gift, and that caused them to go into default, then that's when the lender cares. We come back from break, we'll dig into our debits and credits and do some closing related math, and I'll see you in 10 minutes.
welcome, you made it. I wanted to let you know that you made a great
Welcome back.
Getting a copy of
Sorry,
12
let
months,
me
1 million. Fantastic
rid of
decision.
this. Okay, there we go. Okay, we're back. Let's talk about closing math. Because that is going to be quite a few of those 8 calculations. Remember, there's 8 calculations that are going to show up on the PSI exam. One of those calculations could very well be, what's the total amount the buyer needs to bring to closing? That's going to require you doing several calculations in order to get that one. You have to calculate origination fee, something called interim interest, proration of taxes, all of these things we're about to learn now. And then it all boils down to how much does the buyer need to bring to closing. Another one they could ask is, how much is the seller going to get at closing? That one is a little more likely to show up in the day-to-day of the business. Seller wants to know, okay, you're telling me you can sell my house for $380? Well, how much will I walk away with? So you need to be able to do that in real life. But it all starts here. What do we mean by debits and credits? Has anybody taken an official accounting course in school? This isn't that level. So just think even more basic than that. All this means, debits and credits, is like how you balance your checkbook. I'll bet most of you don't do that, right? You probably balance it, but there's probably, I don't know, is there a physical checkbook anymore? Do they even have those anymore? Or do people just check them online? But the process of, I went to the movies, therefore I paid $800,000 for that night. No, or at least maybe $30 bucks. Did that show up? Did that come out of my checking account? That's a debit. Or my grandma sent me or wired some funds to me or sent me a check and I deposited it into my checking account. That's a credit. And so we're just doing that for all of these various items revolving around a closing. That's all we mean. Charges or credits, debits or credits. Now, some of these debits and credits result from something called a proration. What is a proration? To prorate something means you are figuring out an amount of money that needs to be taken as a debit from one side, buyer or seller, and given as a credit to the other side. That's all that is. So a proration doesn't apply to every single thing, but there are a handful of items in a closing that are prorated. What is it about a proration? It's a proration if it's one amount of money, let's say $350, is going to be debited from the seller, taken from them, and credited to the buyer, given to them. But if it's a proration like that, it's going to be that same amount of money because you're taking that amount from one and giving that amount to the other. And it depends on how long the seller owned the property. The most common way this proration happens in the course, on the test, in the math, and in real life, in a closing, is taxes, property taxes. They get prorated quite often. There's, in fact, 3 possible ways to handle the property taxes when you need to calculate them for a closing. And we'll talk about those. Some other words to know. The word accrued means the thing is due, but it's not yet paid. So maybe your property taxes have accrued, meaning they are due because it is now September 1st or after in the year, and that's when taxes are due. Remember that? They're due. You can pay them as of September 1st. Prepaid means you're paying something in advance before it's due. Prepaid, you're paying it early. So we'll see some things that are accrued, some things that are prepaid. Let's look at some of the typical buyer fees, the buyer expenses that buyers have to deal with. Now, on this list, I need to actually... No, it still works. It still works. So disregard. These are the things the buyer is either going to pay at closing or has already paid before closing. Loan fees. Remember the top box on that closing disclosure? That could be origination fee, which is also mentioned here, right? Origination fee is the last item on the right. That could be one of the loan fees. It could be a tax credit, all kinds of stuff. Attorney fees. Remember, the buyer is the one who actually hires the attorney. And so they pay the bigger chunk of money going to the attorney. The buyer hires the attorney, picks the date and time, usually, and then the seller, if they don't have their own preferred attorney, just lets that same attorney do the few little things that need to be done for the seller. There's not much. One of the things that has to be done for the seller is a preparation of the deed. So that's a seller expense that we'll see on the next page. It's not going to be on this page. But the other attorney fees are, what are they doing? The attorney's doing a title search. They're doing, they're getting the entire loan package from the lender and looking through all of those stacks and stacks of pages, printing them out, and then showing everybody where to sign things, and then scanning them and sending them back to the lender, handling all the calculations for these prorations that we're going to learn about in a minute. A typical attorney fee, well, for this test, it might only show up as $400 or $500, but in the real world, probably $800 to $1,200, depending on, is the buyer using one loan or is it two loans? So there's two loan packages that have to be dealt with. How complicated is the whole thing? Reserves for taxes, and then across from that, reserves for insurance. Those are two things that the buyer also is responsible for paying. Appraisal fee, inspection fees, discount points, interim interest, whatever that is. I'll show you that in a minute. Recording the deed, not preparing the deed. Be careful. Let's know what the difference is. Deed recording is paid by the buyer. Think about this. If you're ever wondering who should pay an item, I can't remember what it said. Think to yourself, who benefits from this thing? So who benefits from the deed being recorded for public record to the whole world, saying, look, this person owns this property? The buyer is the one who's going to be the owner after this closing day, as of this closing day. So recording the deed is the buyer's expense. It's not much. It's probably $20 or $30. It's just literally the expense charged by the county register of city, the register of deeds in the county, to put it on the public record, to scan it, put it in there, stamp it, and say this has been recorded. A survey fee, due diligence fee, origination fee. These plus many more potentially there's a lot of line items here. The buyer has a lot of individual charges involved in this purchase, especially if they're getting a loan. The seller's side has a lot fewer numbers, like line items, but it might be still a pretty good chunk because one of those is the commission. And that commission might be 6-7% of a pretty big number. They are also, for our purposes in this class and also real life, the seller typically pays the excise tax. Remember when we calculated that? Who remembers the formula for calculating excise tax? How do we calculate excise tax? Tell me in the chat. You got it. Good job. $1 per 500 of, there it is, sale price. It's about the sale price. It's a sales tax. And it is officially negotiable. And when you buy new construction and the builder uses their own contract, they slide it over to the buyer's side. But for this class, for this exam, for the PSI, and usually in life, the seller is going to pay excise tax. Some attorney fees, they'll tell you, but the main attorney fee is to prepare the deed, not record it, but prepare it. And the way I remember deed prep is a seller expense, is thinking, what happens if you sell your car and you want to get the most you possibly can for it? You're probably going to wash it and prepare it. and vacuum it, get the McDonald's fries out from under the seats, right? So you're preparing it, you're paying for that to be done. Therefore, the seller prepares the deed. What's actually happening in the preparation of this deed? The seller's not doing it themselves. They're paying the attorney to do it. And the attorney is taking the contract and saying, okay, it's this property. There's the legal description. It's these parties, buyer and seller. It's going to be, because the buyer has told me this kind of ownership, in common, joint tenancy, by the entirety, whatever, and some other stuff. And they'll make that deed with all of those things in mind. They'll prepare it, they'll type it up, write it up. And then they'll just have the seller sign it. The grantor is the only signature they need on the deed, but it's going to say both buyer and seller. So those deed prep fees, in real life, that's probably $400 or $500, just to give you an idea for comparison. And there could be more. There could be other things. What other kinds of fees might the seller agree to pay for the buyer? In the chat, what else might they choose to pay for the buyer? Yeah, I could see that. Dawn says appraisal, but that might be lumped into a big chunk. Any of these fees might be part of something where we negotiate and say the seller's going to pay $3,000 toward the buyer's expenses. So yeah, that's a good one. How about a home warranty? Seller could provide a home warranty. Takes $700. Whatever's agreed upon, really, could be put in there as a seller expense. And then whether seller's paying it or buyer's paying it, it could also be these things. Depending on the time of year when the closing happened, and depending on if they have been paid yet or not. But the most common proration that happens is for property taxes, because the seller has owned it for some amount of time in the year of closing. If we close today, February 27th, then the seller has owned the property from January 1st up to and including February 27th. Let's just say that it's noon, this past noon, like, what is that, 8 hours ago? And we're having a closing today. Well, the seller is going to be responsible for paying the taxes for owning it from January 1st up to February 27th. The seller, by the way, write this one down. Write this down. The seller pays for the day of closing. Oh, wait, we're closing at noon? The seller's only going to be the owner for half of the day. Why is that fair? Well, it's just the way it is. Somebody pays for the day of closing, and it's usually the seller. Especially in a proration, it's always the seller. Always the seller when it's a prorated item that covers the day of closing. And then if there's rent, if it's an investment property, think about this. The seller is selling their investment property. They have a tenant in there. They collected the rent on the first of the month. Okay, here we are, February 27th. 27 days ago, the seller got the full month's rent for February. But we're closing today at noon, because it's noon right now. The seller gets to keep 27 days worth of rent. But how many days are in this month? 28, is that right? No leap year. Then that means the buyer is going to get 1 day, because the buyer will be the new owner for the day after closing and beyond. Now, I say that in real life, right? Because February really is 28 days. But for our purposes in this course and the test, February has 30 days, as do all the other months. Every month has 30 days for the pre-licensing class, just to keep the math easy. So if every month has 30 days and there's 12 months in the year, 30 times 12 is 360 days in the year. So the year is 360, the month is 30 for every month in this class, PSI test included. So with that in mind, February is actually a 30-day month, and we're closing on the 27th. and we're talking about rent, then the seller keeps the rent for 27 days worth from day 1 through 27. The buyer is going to be the owner on February 28th, 9th, and 30th. So the buyer gets 3 of those days worth of rent. So we would figure out what that amount of money is and give it as a credit to the buyer and take it from the seller. Debit the seller, credit the buyer for 3 days worth of rent. Does that make sense? HOA fees. If it's a property in a neighborhood that has a homeowners association, the HOA fees would be prorated within the month too, just like the rent, except as a debit instead of a credit, right? Meaning the seller has maybe already paid the HOA fees through the end of the month. So in that case, then we would be crediting them. It'd be just sort of like the rent. We'd be crediting them back for those 3 days left in the month. So we'll learn more about that when we do the math. Let's see. We talked about this. The month has 30 days. The year has 360. Seller pays for the day of closing. Now, we'll talk about interim interest in a minute. So I'm not even going to address that right now because I don't want to get confusing. In fact, we're gonna go rogue and do this from scratch at this point. Oh boy. Oh, that's hilarious.
This is the best acronym in real estate.
Wow.
It's both of these acronyms combined.
Why is that happening?
It's actually called.
I'm talking to myself and I don't even know it.
Stands for TILA.
I'm glad I'm not saying anything bad. Oh, okay. I know what it was. That was a YouTube video from last time that I had pulled up to see how far we got in the chapter. And I knocked my drink over with the lid on, thank goodness, and it hit the start button. That has never happened before. Whew, that could have been bad. I don't have, me fussing at the dog recorded, so that wasn't a risk, but glad the drink was closed. All right, let's pick a good color. All right. One thing that you're going to have to deal with closing math is property taxes. So let's think of it this way. Again, here's the timeline of a whole year of ownership. Here's January 1st. Here's December. We'll just stay consistent and pretend that December has 30 days. December 30th. Here is this September 1st date. Just as a reminder that that's when the tax bill comes out, and therefore, if it's just September 1st or after, the taxes are available to be paid. So we do it differently if we close in that time frame. Notice too, September 1st is well past the halfway point in the year. So we're going to be dealing with closings that happen right in here in a different way. But let's talk about if closings happen right here first. All the way up to and including August 30th, 31st in real life, 30th in class, right before September 1st. If closing happens anytime in this chunk of time, how do we handle the proration? Well, we're talking about February 27th, so let's keep on going with that today. February 27th, we're closed today. We need to calculate, step 1, calculate the dollars per day of taxes. And so if the test question says that the annual tax bill let's do it this way. Annual taxes are $3,600. then how much are taxes going to cost per day? If they cost $3,600 per year. $360, 3,600 divided by 360. So $10 a day. That's how much taxes are per day. And that's what you're doing in step 1. Figure out the dollars per day in taxes. Step 2, calculate the seller's days that they are responsible for. The number of seller's days. Literally, how long did the seller own it? Up to and including closing day. And so in this case, that means January, $30 days for January because of this class, plus February. How many days in February? 27, because we're closing on the 27th. So that's a total of 57 days to the seller. 57 days is what the seller's responsible for, right? And then I ran out of room already. Oh, no, there it is. Good. Oh, good. Thought I had zoomed too much. Step 3, multiply them together. $10 per day times 57 days equals $570. And then step 4, attribute it properly, meaning figure out who pays what. Is it going to be a debit the seller, credit the buyer? For whose amount? The seller's portion or the buyer's portion? What do I mean by that? The seller's portion of the year of closing or the buyer's portion of the year of closing? Closing is February 27th in this case, so the seller's portion of the year is all the part of the year up to and including February 27th, and the buyer's portion is the rest of it. So when it's a closing happening before September 1st, all we need to figure up is what the seller is responsible for and then give it to the buyer. So we just determined that $570 is the seller's portion because that's $10 a day for 57 days. And the 57 days is what we have from January 1st through February 27th. And so the way we're going to handle this $570 is debit the seller and credit it to the buyer. That $570. That make sense? So if we were to make a rudimentary sheet for buyer and seller that looked maybe something like this: debits and credits for the buyer, debits and credits for the seller. Taxes, in this case, with a closing day of February 27th, is going to look like a debit the seller $570 under this column and credit the buyer the $570. You with me? Notice it's a proration. It's $570 in both columns because we're taking it from one and giving it to the other. This time we're taking it from the seller, giving it to the buyer. Easy? That was not too bad. So this is a true proration. So when we're closing, and it would be the same way we would handle it even if it were August. Let's say we were closing on August 17th. That's later in the year, but still before September. We're going to handle it this exact same way. What's going to be different? If it's an August 17th closing instead of a February 27th, well, the dollars per day stays the same. It's still $10 a day. But now we're going to be adding up days. This time, alternate, right? Well, we'll say this. August 17th is our closing day. Therefore, how do we add up all of those days to the seller? Well, we just say, here's how you can do it in pre-licensing. How many days, which month in the year is August? Second month, third month, 8th month, 10th month? August is the 8th month, right? If August is the 8th month, then just take all of those 7 months before it, multiply that by 30 days each. So there's 210 days for all of 1 through July, right? And then add on the 17 days of August, right? So the total days to the seller that the seller's responsible for is 227. That makes sense? Now that we know this, and this hasn't changed, it's still $10 per day, because for some reason we decided to close August 17th instead of February 27th. I would hate that situation in real life. 227 days times 10 means the seller's portion of taxes are 2270. And so what we're going to do is debit the seller and credit the buyer for 2270. And if we were to put it on our little statement here instead of these numbers, it's going to go in the same place, but it's going to be different numbers. Right? So that one's pretty simple. We're closing before September 1st. It's going to be a debit seller, credit buyer. Now, let's do this. This time, got our January 1st, got our December 30th. Just a reminder, here's our, let's do a little more room here. September 1st is our break point in the year when the taxes come due. Now, this time the closing happens here, October 11th. That's our closing day, October 11th. All right, step one. Oh, I didn't tell you. I need to tell you with the let's do property taxes for the year. Are $5,300. $5,300. So step one. Calculate the dollars per day. If they're $5,300 for the year, how much are they per day? $5,300 divided by what? Divided by 360. $14.72 a day. That's our charge per day for taxes. Now, step two. You need to know another piece of information, because since the tax bill came out September 1st and we're closing October 11th, that seller might have paid them already. If it's my wife, that happened. If it's me, they haven't been paid yet. I'll pay them in December, maybe the 30th. So I need to tell you which happened. Which is it that happened? And let's say this. Let's say that the test question will tell you the seller has paid for the whole year. Have they paid the taxes or not? They're not going to tell you this in a situation where closing happens before September 1st because it's impossible for them to have been paid, right? They can't be paid until September 1st. As of September 1st or after, now the bill could possibly be paid. And since we are in that time frame and the seller has paid them for the whole year, now we need to handle this in a certain way. Well, let's see what happened. What is it? What took place here? The seller has paid for the whole year. Ever gone out to dinner with some old family friend and you get ready to pay the bill, but they already paid it? And you feel weird and you're like, well, I'm thankful, but you snuck one on me right now. I got to pay for yours next time. Well, in this case, the seller has paid for the whole year. We need to give them some money back, don't we? They're not responsible for the whole year, but they paid the bill because then they chose to sell the house and now it's closing on October 11th. So what we need to do is figure out this amount of money that the buyer's responsible for because they're going to be the new owner from the day after closing through the end of the year. And we need to give this amount of money to the seller, whatever it is. So before, on that last version, we closed out here and we figured out this portion, the seller's portion. We didn't even care what the buyer's part of the year for taxes were because the buyer's just going to add that amount to it when the bill comes out. But this time the bill has already been paid. Now we don't need to calculate the seller's portion necessarily. What's going to show up on the closing disclosure is the seller getting a credit for the buyer's portion because the seller's out of pocket for the whole year, and that's not fair to them because they're not owning it for the whole year anymore. They're not going to be the owner on October 12th and beyond. So let's make sure to give them money back. Give them however much money this represents from October 12th, the day after closing, through end of year, because they are still responsible for the day of closing. Seller still has to pay for that, no matter what time of day the closing is. All right, then, with that in mind, here's my advice to you. I know it's tempting. You're thinking, okay, Neil, so I have to calculate number of days. Since we're so far into the year, it'd be way simpler to calculate the buyer's days directly and work backwards and think December, November, October. But I would put money on this happening, that somehow if you do this at least once, you're going to forget or lose track that the seller covers the day of closing. That's going to fall apart in your math. You're going to lose track of who's paying for it, and you're going to give it to the wrong side. The only way to make sure that doesn't happen is to still do step 2 the same as you did before. Calculate the seller's days. I know it's more counting because you're adding up all of these months, but that's the only way to be sure that you're not going to lose track of that darn closing day and screw it up and add it into the buyer's side accidentally. So for calculating the seller's days, it's not that bad. The closing is October 11th. October 11th, that's the 10th month, October is. So that means 9 months at 30 days each is 270 days total. And then the October amount of days is 11 more. So that means 281 days is the seller's responsibility. And again, the only reason I'm suggesting you do the seller's days is so that you don't lose track of who pays day of closing. This way we have it in there. We're done. All right. We have it locked in. The seller's paying for the entire amount of time up to and including the closing. Now here at this point, you could do a couple of different things. You could either go ahead and you could either multiply this dollars per day with the seller's days and get a total, and then subtract that total from the 5,300 for the year. And that'll reveal the amount the buyer's responsible for. And that's, let me think. That's okay to do. I'd probably just do it that way. But what you could also do is say, well, if the seller's days are 281 and the total days in the year are 360, then how many days to the buyer? 360 minus 281. That means 79 days to the buyer, and that's how many we need anyway. So 79 days times the dollars per day. Either one is fine. Whichever one just feels natural in your brain, that's going to be what you automatically go to as what you're comfortable with. Do it that way. I don't see any downside in either of those. Let's go ahead and do it that first way I mentioned. So step 3, take the dollars per day times the number of seller days, 14.72 times 281. That means that seller's responsible only should have to pay $41.36 and 32 cents. That's how much the seller is responsible for the whole year. But remember, they paid already for the whole year. So step 4 is going to be subtract it from the total. That was 5,300. So minus it from the 41.36.32. Oops. And so that means 1163. 68 is the buyer's portion that they're responsible for from October 12th through end of year. And so what do we need to do? Step 5 becomes attribute it properly. And how do we attribute it? Well, the sellers paid the whole year. We need to give them some money back. So we are going to credit the seller's side and debit the buyer's side for the amount of $1163.68. Right? And so if we were to have on the closing disclosure, or if we made a basic one, again, buyer debits credits, seller debits credits, then it's going to be here under the seller credit column, 1163. And then under the buyer's debit column, there it is again for taxes because it's a proration. This time we're taking it from the buyer's side and giving it to the seller's side to make up for the fact that the seller wrote a check for the whole year and they should only have to pay for this part of it. The logic makes sense? All right, that's 2 out of 3. There's one more possibility. These 2 that we've just done so far were both prorations. We figured an amount of money. We took that exact amount from one of them and gave it to the other one. This next one is not a proration because it's another one. We'll keep this part. We'll still do an October 11th closing. Let me see. Let's, there we go. Let's do this. October 11th. No, let me add this one back in. Yeah. All right. This time, let me get rid of this. This time the seller has not paid the taxes. It's me. My job this year. I've not paid him yet. So if the seller's not paid, that means this chunk of time is not covered. Seller's not paid any. And also this, so both of them need to be handled. Well, we're not going to give money to the seller because we're closing on October 11th, which is after September 1st, which means the bill is available to be paid. And so the customary way to handle taxes in this case, when the seller has not paid them yet for the whole year, and it's after September 1st that we're closing, is that we calculate both the amount going that needs to be paid by the seller as well as the amount that needs to be covered by the buyer. And it's going to be a buyer debit, the buyer's portion, and a seller debit, the seller's portion. So a lot of the steps are the same, but that last step, the attributions, what to do with it, it's not a proration. We're not taking from one, giving that same amount to the other. We're taking from each of them their respective amounts. What we do know is that out of the entire $5,300 tax bill for the year, the seller's going to be paying a bigger chunk of it. It's going to be more than half because it's more than half of the year. So, all right, let's pick it up. We know step one, we did that already. Taxes are still $1,472 per day if they're $5,300 a year. So that's done. Step two, guess what I'm going to say? Calculate the seller's days. Again, to make sure we don't lose track of that day of closing. And let me see what that was. Let's cheat. It was 281 days to the seller. Okay. We'll just steal that from our last calculation. 281 days to the seller. And if that's the case, let's go ahead and figure out what that means for days to the buyer. 79. And so then we can just multiply each of these by the 1472 per day. $281 for seller at $14.72 a day means the seller's responsible for $4136.32, and then the buyer's responsible for $1162.88. Now, we just got to that by figuring the number of days for each and multiplying it by the dollars per day. What's a way we could check our math? Let's add these up and see if we get 5,300. It might not come out exactly because of rounding, but when we do add that up, we get pretty darn close. Here's some good news. On the test, both class and PSI, they will not give you one answer choice for this. And then, like in this case, if it says, what's the amount the buyer's going to have to pay in this situation, that answer would be this. They would not also give you an 1163 as an answer choice or an 1162.87. They're not going to do that to you because those are within the realm of a rounding change. And sometimes if you were to leave a big number in the calculator and then multiply that by the number of days versus clearing it out and putting in a rounded version, you're going to get a little bit of a difference. So the answer choices won't mess you up because of rounding. So now that we've calculated the amount each party is responsible for, step 3 would be the attributions. And that means we're going to debit the seller their portion and debit the buyer their own portion. See, it's not a proration. It's not the same amount. They each have to kick in and bring their own amounts. And then what the attorney's going to do is put them together and write one check for the full 5,300 and send that off to the government to pay the taxes for the year, because now it's able to be paid. Some people have asked, well, can we choose if we ask them to? Could the buyer say, well, can we have the seller just give me this 4,100 and then I'll pay it in another month and a half? No. The answer is no. The government's like, yeah, but no. Because we can get it now, it's able to be paid to us. So no, you don't get to collect interest for 45 days or go to Disney real quick and then come up with the replacement. Just, oops, sorry. I had it in my hands, but it slipped away like a fish. So no, that's not going to work. This is how we handle it when the seller has not paid taxes and we're closing after September 1st. So of those three methods, let's look at it this way as a way to remember. Oh, let's do our break first, and then I'll recap it when we come back. See you in 10. Welcome back. Okay. So, property taxes. Let's recap. For property taxes, here's what it looks like. Got our January 1, our December 30, our September 1st. And so if we are closing here up to and including September 1st, we're going to debit the seller and credit the buyer. So first thing, who are you taking from? Who are you giving to? It's going to be the seller's portion of taxes for the year. If we're closing here, it's going to be two possibilities. So if we're closing after September 1st, it's going to be one of two things. Either all right, let's do it this way. Let me think here. If the seller has paid the whole year, it's going to be a debit the buyer and credit the seller, the buyer's portion. And then if it's closing after September 1st and the seller has not paid the taxes, it's going to be a debit seller, debit seller, the seller's portion, and debit the buyer, the buyer's portion. Right? So you might want to recreate this or take a screenshot and just keep it as a sort of a reminder, especially as you're working through these sample questions, test questions and stuff. That's property taxes. It's going to be one of three possibilities. Whenever it's closing, either before September 1st or after September 1st, seller has paid, or after September 1st, seller has not paid. I've gotten the question a couple of times, what if we're closing here, and so we're debiting the seller and crediting the buyer the seller's portion? What about the buyer's portion in this case? It doesn't matter. We're talking about what do we do as of closing day? On closing day, what amounts of money do we account for? We don't need to calculate the buyer's portion in this situation, number one here. If we're closing before September 1st, what the buyer's portion is irrelevant for the closing day, because we're going to figure out the seller's part, give it to the buyer, and then on September 1st or after, that buyer's going to add the seller's part with their own part for the rest of the year together and send the payment off. So calculating it for day of closing, not needed. They don't need to know. It's irrelevant. It won't show up on the closing disclosure either because it doesn't matter. The buyer's just going to add their portion of responsibility to what they got from the seller back when they closed that year. It's either going to be the buyer who does this or the buyer's lender. The lender might be the one who sends it off. But regardless, if it's this first case, closing before September 1st, we don't care what the buyer's portion is. They're going to deal with it later. All we need to worry about is closing day. That's what all this math is we're doing right now. As of closing day, how do we make it fair between the parties? All right. That's taxes. Let's recap a couple things that you probably already remember. This math, this process, let me show you something, by the way, and I'll give you one of these to work on. This is essentially what we're doing. This is what I call it the monster question. This is what that big question could look like. Some version of this on the test. I don't know if it'll be quite this big, but it could be half of these things. Could be a good chunk of these things. So it might say something like this. Use the following to determine what the buyer needs to bring. That could be a question. Or use the following to determine what the seller will receive. Or both. They'll give you the same set of facts and figures, and one question will require you to say what the buyer's bringing, and then the other question will say, so based on these same figures, what's the seller going to get? So you could see one or the other of these on the test. You could also see any one of these individual calculations as a standalone on the test. And they give us some guidelines. Use a 360-day year. Seller's responsible for day of closing. That's nice as a reminder. Don't round when doing calculations, but the things that you calculate will end up, when you get the final answer, round to the closest cent, right? That's the hundreds position, two points after the decimal. And then credits and charges should be made according to common practices in North Carolina. The things that we know buyers pay, the things that we know sellers are responsible for. And so you would go down the list. And that's why I suggest you make that column, that little 2-column thing, seller debits credits and buyer's debits credits. I like to put the thing in the middle of what the item is. It looks something like this. So we've got buyer debits and credits, seller debits and credits, and then I'll just use the middle for the item. So for like taxes, depending on what's what, I'll put it in the right blank. Sale price. How do we calculate, or how do we consider sales price when we're coming up with what the buyer needs to bring and what the seller's going to get? What is the sale price for the buyer? Is it a debit or a credit? The buyer getting it as a credit, or are they giving it as an expense? Sale price. You know this one. Yeah, it's a buyer debit. So the sale price will show up as a buyer debit. Right there. What about loan amount? The loan amount. Oh, by the way, sale price is also a seller credit, right? It's a buyer debit and it's also a seller credit. The seller's receiving it. The loan amount. That one's a little tricky. How does the loan amount get factored into the calculation? Is it the new loan? We're talking about the new loan the buyer's getting. Does it have anything to do with the seller? Loan amount for the new loan has nothing to do with the seller, so we don't have to do anything on their column for it. But on the buyer's side, it's going to be a credit. because the buyer's basically getting that entire loan amount from the lender and immediately turning it over to the seller, of course. Well, the buyer's not really getting it in their possession, but it's being given to the seller as part of the purchase price. And then to the buyer, they get a credit for that loan amount. Because if we have the sale price as a debit that the buyer needs to pay, let's say $360,000, and then a loan amount as a credit that the buyer's getting from the lender on their behalf, and they're going to borrow $300,000 from the lender, then the difference between those two numbers is called the down payment. That's what the buyer's bringing for down payment. Now, this down payment does not include all the other expenses, but the buyer's borrowing $300,000 for the loan amount. And they're paying their own $60,000 as a down payment. Added together, that comes up to the sale price. So there is no place on the actual closing disclosure that says, what's the down payment? Why not? Because they don't need it. Because they have the sale price on there and they have the loan amount on there. And doing that math pretty much reveals what the buyer's providing as a down payment. So for the closing, we don't need a down payment line item. What about excise tax? Who's responsible for excise tax? That's a seller debit. Excise tax, seller debit. Nothing for the buyer, just the seller. What about deed preparation? Who pays that? Oh, good, another seller. So nothing for the buyer, just the seller. What about origination fee for the new loan? Yeah, that's one of many buyer debits. What about discount points? Another buyer debit. What about home inspection? Who cares about that? Not the seller so much. So therefore, it's a buyer debit again. What about rent? It's an investment property. The seller has collected the whole month's rent as of the first of the month, because that's when rent is due. And so we're closing in a part of that month. And so the seller has the whole month. They need to give some back. It's going to be a debit to the seller and a credit to the buyer for the buyer's portion of days of ownership left in the month. Day after closing through end of month. And then finally, something called interim interest. Interim interest, you don't know what that is yet, probably. It has nothing to do with the seller. Let's look at it over here. Interim interest is only a buyer expense. Interim interest, that means for the meantime, essentially. In the meantime. So if this is like a 3-month span of time, we've got February, March, and April. And we're closing today on the 27th. When we close today, what we know as a buyer or their agent, we're going to tell the buyer this, hey buyer, on March 1st, in 3 days, you will not have to make your first house payment. You won't. Not necessary. Because house payments for mortgages happen after you live there. The opposite of rent. If you're renting, you pay on March 1st to have the privilege of living there for the upcoming month of March. But for mortgages, your first full house payment is going to be on April 1st. And it's going to cover the fact that you got to live there the previous month. It's called paying in arrears. Arrears, like that. Another word to know. You're paying a mortgage, you pay mortgages in arrears after the fact, after you lived there. So, you close on February 27th. That buyer's first full house payment is not going to be due until April 1st for having gotten to live there that month of March. All right, well, good. Good for you, buyer. You don't have to make a big payment for like over a month. But the buyer's lender says, yeah, but wait a minute. You're closing on the 27th, and you're going to be a new homeowner on the 27th, the 28th, the 29th, and the 30th. 4 days, including day of closing. So that lender says to that borrower, welcome to the lending family. We're so happy you chose Wells Fargo or Bank of America or whoever we are. We want our money. On the closing day of February 27th, that buyer is going to be charged 4 days of interest on their new loan. And that is called interim interest. It's for the privilege of owning the house for the rest of that month of closing, because the month after closing is going to be covered when they make their first full payment in the future on April 1st. But in the meantime, that still leaves these 4 days unpaid if we don't do it this way. So that lender says, we love you, but we don't love you that much. How many days are left in the month, including the day of closing? 4 of them. 27, 28, 29, 30. Use your fingers and toes if you have to. Wear flip-flops to the PSI so you can use your toes if you need to count. Everything's fair. And that's what we're talking about. So interim interest. For one thing, here's some bullet points to remember about it. It's the buyer's only. Buyer's side only. It's not a proration. We're not prorating because the seller doesn't care. It has nothing to do with them. It's only about the buyer's new loan. And therefore, since it's about the buyer's new loan, write this one down. The buyer pays for day of closing. This is the one exception when I told you an hour ago that the seller always pays for the day of closing. Well, that's if it's a proration. This is not a proration. It has nothing to do with the seller, so why should they have to pay for interim interest on the day of closing? But guess what? The lender says, oh, you're closing on the 27th? And the buyer might say, well, yeah, but we're closing at noon. I'm only going to be the owner from like noon or 1 or so, or whenever that closing gets recorded, that deed gets recorded. I'm only going to be the owner for maybe 10 hours that day. We don't care. You're still going to pay us a whole day's worth of interest for the day of closing, plus the 3 days after that. Buyer pays day of closing. This is a common mistake. When you're doing your calculation, you forget, oh, interim interest, the buyer has to also pay for day of closing. Make sure you add that day in. So here's how it would work. Think of best way to do this. Here's how it's going to look. Test question. They will say the buyer is borrowing a loan amount. They might say the sale price is $450,000. The loan to value ratio is 90%. The loan is at 6% interest for 30 years. And we're closing on February 23rd. How much does the buyer need to pay for interim interest with these facts and figures? Oh my goodness. Did he really just give us a 45-step problem to have to figure out? All right. We're going to need to figure out the number of days. That's the easy part. Step 1. Calculate the number of days including closing. How many is that? February 23rd through the 30th. So if you take the 30th and then subtract the day of closing from it, that's 7, but that's only going to be starting from day after. Let's add for the day of closing back in. So it's going to be 8 days. Let's double check with our toes. Hang on a minute. Let me get my foot up here. I'm just kidding. I've got fingers. February 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th. 8 days. There it is. We did it. So 8 days is how many days of interest we need to calculate. All right, here's where your new skills apply from chapter 11 or whatever finance was. I think that's right. We need a loan amount. If our sale price is $450 and our loan to value ratio is 90%, then what's the loan amount? $450 times 90%. We're borrowing $405,000. That's our loan amount. And if we know a loan amount and an interest rate, then we can calculate the annual interest by doing this. 405 at 6%. Okay. So our loan amount of 405 times our interest rate of 6%. That what we said? Yeah. Multiply them together. Our annual interest paid for the whole year. Does this look familiar from when we had to calculate that horrible problem? What's the loan amount after the first month's payment? We did this step back then. The annual interest is $24,300 a year. And if we know annual interest, we can turn that into daily real easy. So step 3, calculate daily interest. 24,300 divided by 360. That means interest on this loan is $67.50 per day. Now, we already know the number of days that the buyer is responsible for, including day of closing, and we know that the interest per day is $67.50. So we're just going to multiply them together. Days times daily interest. In other words, 8 times $67.50. $540. That's how much we could say attribute, but we know it's just going to be a debit buyer. $540. That gets them covered, settled up for the, I think I said 23rd in this exercise. So let's write that in here. Yeah. So if this is the 23rd that we're closing, it's going to be that through the end of the month. And then on April 1st, will pay for March. But for the month of closing, we got to settle up for the rest of the month, including day of closing. That's what interim interest is. We okay with that? Couple bullet points again. The buyer is responsible for the day of closing with this one. This is the only one where the buyer is responsible for the day of closing. Interim interest. Let's do another one. I'll give you time to do this one. Sale price, $185,000. The loan to value ratio is 75%. The loan is at a 7% interest rate for 30 years. By the way, did you notice that 30 years didn't matter on that last one? We don't even need that officially. And then closing day. Let's say it's March 16th. How much is the buyer being charged for interim interest? I'll give you a second. I'll give you a little bit longer than a second. And let me switch this. So go ahead and when you have it, put that in the chat for me and I'll be the only one that sees it. Whenever you're done, just put that in the chat and I'll know that it's time for me to cover it with you. I'll give you time to give it a shot. If you can read it this small, I'll show you the previous steps from the last one. Okay. What's our first step? Tell me in the chat. There we go. Need to get a loan amount. That's one thing. So 185,000 times 75% means the loan amount we're working with is 138,750. If you did all this stuff but used the sale price instead of the loan amount, you would have been off by a few dollars. And that would quite possibly be one of the answer choices, because on the test, sometimes they will give you an answer choice that leaves out one of the steps. So it could look right because you got that same number, but that was because you skipped something. Step 2, calculate days. How can we calculate days? Well, it's closing on March 16th. So there's 30 days, subtract 16, that's 14 days, but that's starting from day after closing. Let's add back in a day to get that day of closing back. So it's 15 days, including day of closing combined. Step 3, figure out the interest. Let me do that over here. Interest daily. It starts with annual interest, then we can get interest daily, but annual interest comes from the loan amount times the interest rate. The rate was 7%. The loan amount was this 138,750. So annual interest, $97.12.50. And then we can divide that by 360 to get our daily. So it's $26.98 per day. Step 4, multiply them together. So multiply that 26 times the 15 days. 26.98 times the 15 days. 404.70. Debit buyer. What would have happened if we had forgotten the loan amount step and taken the price of 185 and multiplied that by the 7% and then get our daily and then multiply that by the 15 days? That would have given you a 539.58. And that quite likely would be one of the other answer choices as sort of a decoy. So don't forget, we're dealing with loan amount because it's the loan we're talking about, the interim interest for the loan. We okay there? So that's one that gets people. Be careful. All right. What else? Let's look back at that big old monster problem. So here it is. And in this problem, there it is. There's interim interest mentioned. But what else could we see that could be a single standalone math problem besides the monster problem that we're looking at? Well, we got a sales price. We have a closing date. Taxes, that certainly could be a thing. We just did that. Let's see. Let's look for new things that we haven't run across. The earnest money and the due diligence money, both of those are going to count as credits to the buyer's side. And then the seller's loan payoff is going to be a debit to the seller's side because the seller has to pay off their existing loan. The insurance policy for the new buyer's insurance, just to let you know, that is collected for the whole first year at closing. The first year's homeowner's insurance premium is due at closing. In this case, $637 to start up that insurance policy. That is collected at closing. One more buyer debit. Oh, here's one. We know how to do this. Total brokerage commission. Seller's paying that. That'll be a seller debit for message in the chat. What was the closing date from that problem that we did a minute ago? It was what was it? It was February 23rd on that problem. Let's see. Commission 5% of the sale price. So 193,750 times 5%. That's easy math. We know how to do that. Financing. Here's where we're going to get some various pieces that need to go into this puzzle. It's one place. It's how we're going to know what the loan amount is. It's 90% LTV. It's also how we're going to get the interest rate that we need in order to calculate interim interest, because that is 7% interest. It also tells us that the lender is charging 1.5% for an origination fee. And they're charging for 3 discount points that the buyer is going to pay for. What about those things? Let's pause for a minute and work with this. 193,750 is our sale price. Let me transfer that over. And it's saying the origination fee is 1.5%, and the discount points are 3 of them. So if the test question said, what's the total amount the buyer needs to pay for both origination fee and discount points combined, what would the answer to that be? Sale price is 193,750. A loan to value ratio of 90%. Origination fee being charged is a 1.5% and 3 discount points. How much is the buyer going to have to pay for both discount points and origination fee combined? So you could do this two different ways. You could calculate the dollars for origination fee and then the dollars for discount points and add them together. Or you could know that origination fee is 1.5% of the loan amount and discount points is 3% of the loan amount. And that means that both of them combined are 4.5% of the loan amount. And so just do that. 4.5% of whatever 90% of 193,750 is. So 4.5% of 174,375. 78, 46, 88. Good job. All right. Back to the monster. Things were paid outside of closing in this transaction. That happens a lot. The borrower paid up front when they applied for the loan. They had to pay $350 for an appraisal report and then another $60 for the credit report. And as far as calculating what the buyer needs to bring to closing or what the seller's going to get, these don't factor in at all. They were already paid. The buyer doesn't need to bring it again, pay it again. They paid it once. So it will be reflected on the closing statement as POC, paid outside of closing. So we don't need to do anything with that except make sure not to include it in our math. We did interim interest. And then here's the thing, referencing private mortgage insurance for the first year due at closing. Remember about private mortgage insurance? Since this borrower is borrowing more than 80%, putting down less than 20%, they're borrowing 90, putting down 10. If they're only putting down 10, remember the lender would really rather they put down 20. But since they're not, the lender wants to get them to have a private mortgage insurance policy for the difference between the 10 and the 20. Whatever dollar amount that is, there's going to be a private mortgage insurance policy covering that amount that the buyer pays for, that the lender benefits from in case the loan defaults. If the buyer loses the house to foreclosure, the lender is covered by that little bit of 10% difference there, as well as being able to foreclose on the whole house for the rest of the amount of the loan. So for calculating this thing, that private mortgage insurance premium for the first year due at closing is going to be a debit to who? Who's paying for that 713 PMI premium? Yep, it's a loan thing. So that's a buyer debit. Now, they reference a couple of things here. Escrow, collecting for escrow, escrowing for taxes and insurance. And here's what's happening. The lender is sending an email to the closing attorney. And the paralegal is going to do all this work. She's going to read it and she's going to say, oh, lender wants us on day of closing to collect 4 months worth of property taxes from the buyer and collect 3 months worth of homeowner's insurance from the buyer and collect 2 months worth of private mortgage insurance premiums from the buyer. And using all three of these chunks of money, we're going to take it from the buyer, send it over to the lender, and the lender is going to set up an escrow account where they just keep that buyer's money there. And then every month with the payment of PITI, principal, interest, taxes, insurance, that tax and that insurance and that PMI that's being paid every month is going to also go into that escrow account. Because the taxes and insurance and PMI are not paid out monthly. They're paid out probably once or twice a year, probably once a year. So it's just sitting there available, added to every month. And so that the full amount is ready with a little bit of cushion so that when the bill is now due to be paid, there's plenty there to do so. So this is just setting up that escrow account so it's ready when those bills come due later in the year. So that means for calculating our thing for what the most the buyer needs to bring, we need to figure out how much the property taxes are for the year, divide it by 12 to get the taxes per month, and multiply the monthly property taxes by the number of months the lender wants to be collected. So 4 months worth. And the same thing for the homeowner's insurance. We learned back here that the policy for the year is $637. So $637 for the whole year means if we use our calculator, divide it by 12, that means $53 a month. And they want to collect 3 months of insurance. So it's going to be $159.25 collected to set up the insurance escrow account. The tax one, they told us in the question that the taxes, let's see, where did it go? Are $1,843 a month. So in our calculator, we will just take that, divide it by 12. Taxes per month are $153. And so the question or the instructions say to collect 4 months worth. And so it'll be $614.33 that the closing attorney takes from the buyer, requires the buyer to pay. It's that much more the buyer needs to pay. It's going to be sent to the lender to set up the tax escrow. And then that private mortgage insurance item, I don't know that you're going to have to mess with this, but just in case, I think I have seen it on a test question before. For setting up these escrow accounts, it says the lender wants to collect 2 months for private mortgage insurance. This is a little different than taxes and homeowners insurance. They're telling us what the monthly renewal cost is going to be for private mortgage insurance in this case. So instead of having to take that private mortgage insurance premium that we learned about back here, where'd it go? Here it is. This private mortgage insurance premium of $713, we don't need to take that, divided by 12 and multiply by 2. We just do $43.32 per month times 2. That's how we figure that part out. And then the rest of them, I think there might be one more thing we have to calculate, but the rest of them are just knowing who pays for what. The attorney fee, that's a buyer debit. The title insurance premium, they don't say which is owners, which is lenders. So combined, both of them combined are $211. That's going to be a buyer debit. What about deed prep for $200? Who pays for that? Yeah, that's a buyer thing. I'm sorry. Deed prep is a seller thing. Deed prep is seller. Deed recording is buyer. And then mortgage recording fee is another buyer one. And then excise tax, we know how to calculate that. $1 per 500 of sale price. Survey is a buyer expense. Pest is a buyer expense. And then a courier fee for mailing the loan documents to the buyer's lender, $40 to the buyer. And then courier fee to send off the final loan payoff for the seller, $40 debit to the seller. We'll pick this up, do a few more of these, work on some of this so that you'll bring some questions to me. And we'll do a monster question for buyer bringing and seller getting tomorrow. And then we'll just continue on. Our next chapter is about valuing property, appraisals compared to market analysis that we do as brokers. So I'll see you then. Have a great night. Put your name in the chat for me, please.